behind, mostly because of economic reasons. I mean, plenty of them were inspired by the Revolution and moral reasons, definitely. But they wouldn't have been able to leave slavery behind if they had large plantations, because at that point it was seen, if you had large plantations, you had to have slavery. So Missouri, when it applies to the estate, is going to challenge this balance that had been held since the Revolution of slave states and free states. So up until 1820, there were 12 free states and 12 slave states. So if Missouri comes in as a slave state, that means the balance of power in the houses of Congress is going to tip towards those who want to increase the use of slavery in the western states. And the Southerners want that. And a big reason is cotton. Cotton is going to become a cash crop around the same time, or it has become a cash crop by that time. The soil had been exhausted in places like South Carolina, Georgia, other areas where there had been long-term tobacco growth and stuff like that. And so they're thinking, I want to take the system we have, the plantation slavery system, and export it into this new western territory, and we'll grow this new cash crop cotton and make a lot of money. And also, they were afraid if the Northerners made all the new territory free states, that they would outlaw slavery and they wouldn't be able to have slaves at all. So both sides, it's a political argument over representation, main thrust here. So we're continuing that pattern of compromise when we come to the Missouri Compromise. So they do this. They say, okay, we want to maintain a balance, and we don't want to end up having to go into a conflict. That's going to be the story of this whole unit. Up until the Civil War, they're trying to compromise, keep the balance, keep the peace, don't go to war. And we can look back now and say, well, obviously they're going to end up going to war. But at the time, it was anything but. So they do two things in this compromise. One, they do admit Missouri as a slave state. But to balance that admission, they cut off part of Massachusetts and make the state of Maine and admit that as a free state. And that way you have the balance. And then the second part of it is that an imaginary, well not imaginary, but a line was drawn across the country at 36 degrees north, 36 degrees, 30 minutes north. It doesn't matter. It's a latitude. It's a line across the country. My grandfather's a map maker. He'd be like, so depressed. I can't express like map terms. They draw this line across the country and they say, okay, from now on, whenever states come into the Union from the big territory, if they come in below the line, later on it's sort of informally known as the Mason-Dixon line, yes. But that line actually crosses through some states that remain slave states. So basically, yeah. So the line, below the line, a state comes in, they come in as a slave state. If they come in above the line, they come in as a free state. And this way, the balance will be maintained. And the representative body of the government will not be controlled by either people who want slave labor in the West or people who want free labor in the West. And the Northerners, not only do they not want Southern slaveholders to run the whole government, but they also are afraid about what will happen to the lower class white men. If slave labor goes all over the West, then where will the lower class white men be able to find jobs? How will they be able to pick out their piece of land, start a farm, and then, progress as the early colonists did? So this idea becomes known as free soil. So most Northerners may not have cared that much about slavery, the morality of slavery, but they cared a lot about free soil because they didn't want the competition of slave labor. And the compromise was very well accepted on both sides. So the South gets Missouri, it gets a new slave state, it gets new territory to move into with their new cash crop of cotton. And the North can make sure that they can forbid slavery above that line and keep the political balance. There is a slight northern advantage to the compromise because there is a lot of Spanish territory in the southwest of the United States at this point. And so while they could see clear to the Pacific Ocean on the northern side where they could expand, on the southern side they've got the Spanish in the way. And unfortunately for the slaveholders, I guess, the Civil War got in the way and slavery ended up getting ended before they could even expand into Spanish territory. For the most part.
I'm sorry, I missed that completely. You said there was an advantage of the North?
Yes, because the Spanish are in the southwest. So if you're looking across the country to expand, the Southerners are going to get blocked at some point by the Spanish territory.
Okay.
They managed to get Texas and Florida, but then they can't go any further. Whereas on the northern side, there was at least no European nation in a way. They still had Native Americans there that they would have to fight, but that was not seen as relevant. Okay, so there was a slight northern advantage to the compromise, but the Southerners were not that concerned about the Southwest because you couldn't grow their type of plantation crops there. So. All right, so what is the legacy of the Missouri Compromise? Well, it lasts 34 years, and so it does preserve the Union for that amount of time. There wasn't immediate conflict over slavery. But slavery ends up being the dominant issue in politics from this point forward, up until and including the Civil War. And one of the legacies is the South begins developing a distinct national identity. So thinking of themselves as a country, not just a region of the United States, but thinking that in the back of their minds, there was this idea, we may need to separate to preserve our interests, preserve our way of life, meaning preserve slavery, because they're very concerned that the Northerners are going to, at some point, pass a law, gain a majority in the House and Senate, and pass a law to outlaw slaves just outright. That was never going to happen. There just wasn't enough interest in the North, but they're afraid of it. A lot of fear in Southern politics. So they're hoping if they can go west and settle more people who can start plantations, then they'll have more allies, political allies, and economic allies. Okay, so also adding to the United States gains Florida, which had been Spanish. Don't really want to talk much about it, just to say that from this point forward, counts Florida into the mix. They had already been gaining on the Spanish in western Florida, so they really just got the last bit. Well, the United States, yeah. It is the Southern States. Okay, now we're going to talk about something called the Market Revolution. So getting into economics a little bit. Right at the end of the Revolutionary War, there was an invention called the cotton gin. If you remember your elementary school textbooks, it's Eli Whitney invents cotton gin. I don't know why, of all inventors, I think maybe him and Edison. I feel like two people anybody knows invented anything. Before the cotton gin, cotton was not profitable as a cash crop. It also was not largely used in clothing or other domestic items because it took 20 slaves to make like a pound of cotton in an hour. You have to take the seeds, the little puffs you see in the cotton commercials, you see the fields or whatever. There's like the little cotton puffs on the plant. when you pull those off, you gotta take the seeds out so that you can then spin it into thread and make thread and cloth, etc. And taking the seeds out is a long process. Also, cotton plants are very sharp. So they slice you to ribbon while you're picking it. And so for the plantation owners, it was never something they could make into a cash crop until the cotton gin. And that's very unfortunate because the founding fathers thought that slavery would die out. It was actually on the decline when they wrote the Constitution because the soil had been kind of tapped out for tobacco and varieties from the other things that they were planting on plantations. And then all of a sudden, there's cotton. Not only can you make thread out of it, but then there's cottonseed oil and all of it. And so slavery actually increases from the invention of the cotton gin, which happened in 1793. It's around the time of the Revolutionary War. So before this, people were mostly wearing wool or linen clothing, and cotton is very breathable, soft, there's a lot of advantages to it, plus there's the whole cash crop thing. There's other inventions happening at the same time. Whitney also invents interchangeable parts, which is maybe even more important in a way. Specifically, he invented it for muskets. So before this, to have a musket, you needed to make every part for that musket individual for that gun. And if a part broke, you're kind of out of luck because you can't order a replacement. You have to cast or machine a perfect replacement to go in that particular part of the gun. So interchangeable parts means that when your musket breaks, you just get that little, trigger mechanism or whatever from a manufacturer. And so this also means that factories can start to grow in large scale in the north. And what they make is textiles. Textiles being cloth, clothing, thread, yarn, that kind of thing. And so it's perfectly timed to coincide with the rise of cotton. So there's all these factories in the north who may say that they're for free labor, but where are they getting their raw materials? They're getting it from the south. And even Britain had been the largest supplier of cotton to the United States. Before this period, the South ends up supplying almost all of Britain's cotton. And so when the Civil War happens, the Confederacy actually tries to get Britain in on their side to help them. So you have this sort of unholy alliance of northern factory owners and southern plantation owners where they're both dependent on each other, but politically they're opposed to each other. And this is sort of inevitably leading you down the road to the conflict of the Civil War. And they, at the time, would not have seen it that way, as we never see it that way when we're in the middle of things. There's also some other inventions, don't need to write these down, but it's kind of interesting, that help with farming in the West, such as John Deere invents a steel plow. Plows before that were wooden, if you can believe that, to break up some soil in your garden with a wooden plow, or a wooden tool, like a stick, basically. So, yay, John Deere. And there were some new other farming equipment advances, the mower, reaper, by Cyrus McCormick. And this means that people could go out west and start things like wheat farms and produce food and things like that. So you have these new inventions that are changing the market. And then our two other big parts of the market revolution. First, transportation. So up until this time, your transportation is limited to being able to sail on a river. That's why gaining access to Mississippi was so important. You could take your crops or other goods on a river and sell them. Other than that, you had to roll them over the ground in wagons, and that is slow. So if you're growing a food crop, it could rot by the time it gets to New York. So the dilemma for someone who wants to settle out west is, how do I, say, start my wheat farm, grow my wheat? How do I then communicate with my buyer in the major cities and then get my product to the buyer in time for it to be sold and then get my profits back? So imagine every communication takes weeks. Every time you need to send a shipment, it takes weeks, and you have no idea, there's no tracking number, you don't know what's happening to it while it's on the road. So that's the problem that is facing people who want to settle out west. And one of the initial solutions is to build canals. And the major canal that was built at the time was the Erie Canal, which connected Buffalo to New York City, and then that connects to Lake Erie. So that meant that farmers in Ohio could put their goods on these sort of flatbed boats, like barge-like boats, and you could push it down the canal to get it to New York, which is your biggest port city. And then it could be sold not only all throughout the United States, but internationally if you get it to New York City. So they could, once they have the communication part of this equation, say, oh, I don't like the prices in the United States, so I'm going to sell to Britain, or I'm going to sell to France, or wherever they want. So to build a canal is an artificial body of water, so it has to be dug and filled with water. It was agonizing work, horrible deaths, injuries, and all that, but the biggest problem was money. How do you pay for a municipal project of this size, and then how do you coordinate between different states, because this is going to cross state lines. So who is going to be in charge of this? And there's only one entity that can step in this situation, and it's not private business. Well, we hear a lot today about private business should run everything, private industry, this, that, can do anything, but not always true. In this circumstance, there certainly was not enough money in any private business to build something as large as a canal. So think about today, private businesses don't build bridges. The government makes the bridge decision, and then they hire different contractors for each part of it, so the private business gets their piece, certainly, but you couldn't hire just one, there's no webuildbridges.com. You have to get all these different things in order. And that's what happens with the canal, is that you have to have government participation across states, and the only way to do that is to do that at high level. And so what we have is an increase in people's expectations of what the government is supposed to do. So Jefferson would have been appalled. Jefferson would have said, this isn't in the Constitution. You can't do this, this isn't what we meant. Of course, he's the one who fought the Louisiana Purchase, so. It was on sale, so we can't blame him for that. And it did have the Mississippi River included as a bonus, so it's a gift item. So it's very hard to live by those principles, I think. And it's also hard, to be forward thinking. None of the founding fathers could have understood the internet. You'd be like, I'd go to the website, and they'd be like, well, what's a website? Try to explain that to someone in 1790. You can't. So canals are our first foray as a nation into this idea that government is supposed to provide things for the citizens. So before this, what the government did was make laws, enforce laws, and that was pretty much it, and then deal with foreign nations. So it's not this idea that government was then supposed to provide you all these services for the tax money. They just simply protected you and made trade deals and that kind of thing. But it's great that people are very accepting at the time, because the farmers who are going out to Ohio are saying, okay, it's going to be worth my investment to go drive out to what was then the end of the world for them and try to start a small business. Now, canals are very limited. You have to have bodies of water that they can travel to and from, because they have to fill with water. So there's only so many places you can put canals. Luckily, interchangeable parts and other inventions, steam power and so forth, allow things like steamboats. So now you can travel the opposite direction of a river. So the Mississippi River becomes that much more of a sort of early highway. And then railroads. which is the big one. Because you can put a railroad across anywhere. They blow up mountains and put it through mountain ranges. They build bridges and they put it over water. You can put a railroad anywhere. And so the big dream is to build a transcontinental railroad where you could get on the railroad on the East Coast, and then eventually you'd reach the West Coast when they acquired all that land. So, all of this is going to lower the price of goods for people, which everybody always loves, right? Makes things faster. You get your goods faster, over longer distances. The farmers are able to diversify as to where they're going to sell to and have more control over their production. This also leads to a growth in government. Not only are they funding canals and railroads, now later on railroads will all be owned by corporations. So a lot of corporations now will say, look at the great days when the railroad companies did all this stuff and America was great. And it's like, well, they started building railroads because the government gave land grants. So they said, here, take this free piece of land and you can build a railroad across it. Well, so, railroad company had to buy the land, that would have been an added cost, maybe they wouldn't have invested. So, I think it's good that we have these opposing forces of what, things government can and can't do. But it's kind of interesting here's these extreme positions based on history. This isn't really right. They're also giving land grants to individuals, saying, in some cases, you can have land free if you go out there and settle it within 5 years. You just go out there, build a little house or put up a tent or whatever, set out your boundaries, and you start to work and improve that land, and you just have it. Now, of course, people are being displaced for that, but we'll get to that a little later. So there's land grants, canals, railroads. This is all good. Government is creating the conditions for economic growth. So the last part of our equation is communication. Once you start getting way out in Ohio and farther west, how do you communicate with your buyers back in New York City when you want to send your stuff? And luckily, this is an explosion of time of invention because the telegraph is invented. And so it's like the internet of its day, really, because before that, there was letters. So all the millions of years of history that led up till the telegraph, the only invention has been to go from stone to paper. So now we're taking the idea of, I want to send a message to someone in New York, and they're going to get it then. So that was incredible. Rather than 6 weeks from now, or maybe never, because maybe the Pony Express rider got killed by Native Americans on the way, and no one ever knew. Now you can go to the telegraph office and say, I want to send this to my buyer in New York today, and see, I got 20 bills of this or that. Will they buy it? For how much? If you don't like it, you send out another message. The telegraph, very important. Government also is the one building the telegraph line. And they administrated the telegraph offices. So again, government is creating the conditions for economic growth. And so this leads to what we call the market revolution. These are all the parts of the market revolution. And what happens to the market in the world? People want to settle the frontier. You don't have to entice them as much because it's been, pretty good business opportunity. There is a tie that develops between the Midwest and the East Coast. And that's going to be very important in the Civil War, to which side the states are going to fall in the Civil War. The West is going to be more connected to the North because most of the ports are there, most of the buyers are there. They're producing raw goods. The South is producing raw goods. Where are the factories? They're in the North. And so there's going to be a strong tie between North and Midwest, but not with the South. The North is going to leap ahead of the South in transportation. So the southern West is not settled as much, And this also means when we get to the Civil War that the South is not going to have as many railroad lines. So when a railroad line gets cut and they can't move their troops or supplies, it's a big military disadvantage for them because they're not able to move as quickly as the Union. There is a rise in the standard of living overall. There's cheaper goods, more goods available. People love that. People can specialize in their jobs more and more so, especially in factory systems where you're maybe only doing one task all day. But the better you are at that task, the higher your pay could be. Then you can buy more goods. There's a big push for urbanization in the north. The factories offer very attractive jobs, especially for young, unmarried women who never have been able to work outside of the home before, except as servants or sometimes school teachers. Though even in this period, school teaching was mostly a man's profession. Women were not thought to be intelligent enough to be teachers. They were wrong. We can't fault them for that. They didn't know. It's only when they needed teachers to actually go out west and be in horrible conditions that they hired young women. I love that. So people start to go to the cities, and young women are able to earn money and send it home. They're able to have a little bit of independence. Although the factories did monitor their behavior and living, which is strange to us today. Imagine your job telling you when you should be home at night. Very strange idea. Although companies did that with women until the 1960s and 70s, so.
Still that way in China.
Yes. Like, you know that show Pan Am that's on right now? I watched one episode, and because my specialty is the 20th century, I kind of have a hard time watching shows that are historical about the 20th century, so I'm like, that's wrong, that's wrong. And the women are like doing whatever they want, kind of on the show, when really they had very strict codes. They would have people inspect their clothing. They'd be written up for not wearing girdles. They had houses they lived in, like dorms. Grown women over the age of 18, told when they could come home, told they couldn't have male visitors. And so, yeah, it takes a long time for women to get going. So people want to live in cities is the end game of that, and the North is going to come out victorious economically. The South, yes, the top planters who are planting a lot of cotton are making a lot of money. But most of the population, 75% of the white population, did not own slaves. And so they are completely at the mercy for jobs of people who can hire them for whatever, because most jobs can be done by the enslaved labor. So lower class whites were usually slave catchers. They maybe had a tiny piece of land they could farm. Most of the good land was eaten up by the plantations. So 75% of the white population was under the thumb. Really, not even the remaining 25% of slaveholders. Most of them own 10 slaves or less. So 10 slaves or less is a small farm. The big plantations are hundreds and hundreds of slaves, and that's like the top 1%. So it was very much a uneven way of life in the South. So people see a lot more opportunity for how can you improve your situation in the South? All the land is taken. There are no jobs, because there's only unfree labor. So the only job you can get is keeping the slaves in line. But they're told, at least you're better than them. And so the poor whites buy this line, because what else do they have to hold on to? But in the North, there's all this progress. And that is the market revolution. And it's going to change America in huge fundamental ways. I saw speech of President Obama not too long ago, and some comedians were making fun of it, and because he was talking about building high-speed rail and putting high-speed internet all over the country, and I saw all the comedians were like, well, that's boring, that's not an interesting plan. And I was like, well, that could be like a new market revolution, because there you got the communication and you got transportation. That means I could live here but work in D.C., and that would improve my job possibility.
I think I'll go on down his right for D.C. to Metro.
Not high speed.
Oh, I thought it was high speed.
No.
The high speed that he's talking about is like what they have in Japan.
Oh, like what they have everywhere else in the world. Or if you live in California, huge state, but living in LA is really expensive. But say you want one of those LA jobs,
That's a good idea.
It is a good idea, but people were like, that's not fun, that's not sexy.
Oh,
Here.
that's sexy, because that's exactly the job.
I thought it was a good idea, but it really reminded me of this market revolution thing. You've got the communication and the transportation at once, and then you harness that and build, you could use some economic growth. So. Right. And that clock is wrong, it is not 3:40.
You know, everybody look at that clock.
Really, you're at the wrong time. Okay, let's take a break now for 15 minutes.